Good day, everyone. Welcome to this side event on the rule of law solutions at the nexus of climate, conflict, and food security. A warm welcome to everyone who joins us at this moment in time. And we're very pleased to see that many of you have been able to dial in. We are most grateful for the opportunity to host this dialogue here as part of the Berlin Climate and Security Conference. And many thanks, of course, to the colleagues at the German Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Adelphi for organizing. The webinar today will last 90 minutes, so we have time to delve into the many challenges and explore rule of law approaches to the nexus of climate, conflict, and food security. We have three excellent panelists to guide us, and we are really fortunate to have with us Marina Mastrorillo. She's a senior economist in the climate security team at the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT. And we have Hermina Pajo, climate justice specialist at IDLO. We will also soon be joined by Elisa Scalise. She is a lawyer and practitioner, currently director of land and resources rights at the World Resources Institute. She is still finding her way to join us online, but we're very confident that she will be with us within a minute. But with no further ado, I think we should get started with the webinar. My name is Arthur van Buitenen. I work at IDLO as a policy and engagement advisor, and I'll be moderating the upcoming 90 minutes. So we will first hear from our three panelists. We'll then dive into a Q&A with some specific questions. And of course, we would also love to hear from you. So please use the Q&A function if you have a question. And our colleague Daniel here will make sure to bring your questions to the dialogue. And I should also say that this webinar is recorded. So we know that people worldwide rely on land and natural resources for their livelihoods. The adverse effects of climate change, environmental degradation, natural hazards induce scarcity in arable land, forest, rangelands, and they drive competition and conflict between users, undermining stability of food systems. Women and girls are among the populations most affected by these effects. And that's despite the fact that women and girls are major contributors to food production and often, as we know, holders of traditional knowledge, which is so important. Ensuring their equal participation in food systems can have transformational impacts for food security on a larger scale. And the rule of law is a crucial enabler for climate justice, inclusive land governance, and food systems transformations. And this is exactly what we will be diving into in this webinar. And Hermina, I would like to start with you, and I would pose you the first question. The rule of law as an enabler of peace, sustainable development, and human rights. So when applied to a context of food system transformation, how can strengthening the rule of law lead to better outcomes for both food security and climate action? So, Hermina, the upcoming 7 minutes are yours. Up to you.
Thank you, Arthur, so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. It's a great pleasure to be here today and participate in this panel in an excellent company of our speakers. Let me start with saying a few words about my organization. IDLO is the only intergovernmental organization that is entirely dedicated to enhancing the rule of law as an enabler of peace, sustainable development, and human rights. We work both with governments to enhance legal and regulatory frameworks and to build effective people-centered institutions. But we also work with justice recipients to legally empower them so that they can effectively claim their rights and participate in decision-making processes. In the context of our conversation today, actually, it is my great pleasure to present outcomes and main findings on our most recent policy brief, Rule of Law for Food Systems Transformation, in which we focused on the question precisely how we can address food insecurity through the rule of law approach so that we can achieve the goal of ending hunger by 2030, while also addressing climate justice and preventing conflict. I will be happy to paste a link to our policy brief in the chat later. So what are our key findings? So let me first refer to available data indicating that in 2022, 258 million people experienced acute food crisis, and around 9.2% of the world population was affected by global hunger. And among those, importantly, among those who are most food insecure are people who already experience systematic exclusion and marginalization, and in particular, women, youth, indigenous people, smallholder farmers, pastoralists, people on the move like migrants and refugees. And these were the groups that we focused on specifically in our research, in our study. What we also observed is that in the recent years, food security significantly decreased. And this is due to the intersecting crisis, for which key drivers are climate change, economic shocks, high cost of healthy diet, and violent conflicts. Also, other factors contributing to food insecurity are loss of biodiversity, erosion of soils, desertification, but also social injustices in access to land and water and other natural resources. I would also like to mention that there is a very specific interconnection between food security and climate change, and I'm sure Marina will later on expand on that. But just for now, on the one hand, climate change and biodiversity loss negatively affect food security and stability of food systems, also undermining the right to food and other human rights like right to clean and healthy environment. On the other hand, agricultural production systems actually contribute currently to up to 20% of greenhouse gas emissions and are estimated to drive over 75% of global deforestation. Similarly, when we look at while food security can be significantly undermined in times of armed conflict, food security itself can be a driver of tensions, conflict, competition over scarce resources, such as land or water. And then additionally, countries that are affected by conflict and natural disasters have limited capacity to then recover and rebuild their food systems due to the fragility, because they suffer from the fragility of their societies and institutions post-conflict. And overall, our research showed that countries where the rule of law has improved have demonstrated not only more effective transformative climate action, conflict prevention, but also better food security indicators such as lower malnutrition. So how can we achieve that? In our study, we have identified several key elements that are necessary to accelerate food systems transformation through rule of law approaches. And first, our study showed that we need to empower the most food insecure people so that they can claim their rights, participate in decision-making to then inform and shape food policies. And here priority must be given to women and girls, youth and children, indigenous people, smallholder farmers, pastoralists, and people on the move, including refugees, migrants, and internally displaced people. Going further, we also need to embrace a feminist approach to rule of law and food security in all dimensions. And I'm sure Elisa will expand on that more. We'll hear from her more on that. We also need to focus on strengthen food systems governance through developing fair and effective laws and regulatory frameworks, but also to build and strengthen people-centered institutions. This way, we can ensure that people have effective access to justice, especially those who seek their right to food through both formal and informal pathways to justice. We also, through developing effective laws and inclusive laws, we foster overall sustainability and resilience across food systems, and also enable inclusive decision-making and promote responsible investment. Going further, our research indicated that we need to improve and safeguard equitable access to land, water, and other natural resources, as this is the foundation for people and communities across the globe for food security and nutrition, while also remembering that the rule of law approach is instrumental. It's important to enforce respect for planetary environmental boundaries, to protect biodiversity, and promote climate mitigation and adaptation while improving food and nutrition for all. For instance, laws and regulatory frameworks can promote biodiversity policies. We can protect traditional knowledge that enhances biodiversity and food security, or strengthen overall human rights and good governance principles. In that sense, wrapping up, our study demonstrated that when we actually work at the intersection of different sustainable development goals, and here the SDG 2, Zero Hunger, SDG 16, which is about peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, as well as SDG 5, gender equality, and SDG 13, climate action, we can adopt a holistic approach to achieve food security for all, contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation, and build peaceful and resilient communities. Therefore, we can, by working holistically, we can advance the global agenda. I'll pause here and thank you so much. Over to you, Arthur.
Thank you so much, Emina, for setting the scene so wonderfully, and for our two next speakers to more dive into the context. With that, Marina, could I ask you the following question, and also ask you to build on Emina's intervention and setting the scene? The question we would like to pose to you is, what are the main ways in which climate change impacts food and agricultural systems, and how does this increase the likelihood of conflict arising between and within communities or between armed groups? So with that, the upcoming 7 minutes are yours. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Arthur. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very, very glad to be here today and participate in this super important, super interesting discussion. So once again, thank you for the invitation. My name is Marina Mastrorillo. I'm senior economist at the CGIAR Climate Security Team at the Alliance of Biodiversity and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. Just let me very briefly say a few words about my team. We are a multidisciplinary team of more than 45 people located in 7 regions where most climate security hotspots are located, such as East and North Africa, the MENA region, West Africa, and so on, across 16 countries. And at the core of our mandate is the commitment to provide scientific evidence on the interlinkages existing between climate change and human security, and with a particular focus on understanding the indirect pathways and mechanisms through which this relationship manifests itself, such as those related to food, land, and water insecurities. And indeed, there is increasing evidence indicating that human security is and will be progressively, increasingly threatened as the climate changes. And some of the factors that increase, in fact, the risk of conflict, such as food insecurity and natural resources scarcity, are highly sensitive to climate change. And yet people, as Irmina was saying, people living in places affected by political instability and conflict are particularly vulnerable to climate change. So let me just mention some documented facts to support this. So the vast majority of the chronically food insecure and malnourished people live in countries affected by conflict. An estimated 489 million of 850 million undernourished people, and an estimated 122 million of 155 million stunted children. And most of the food insecure population are also the most exposed and vulnerable to climate shocks and extreme. And climate change will keep increasing the level of food insecurity through extreme weather events, natural disasters, but also economic and social disruptions. Since 2022, according with the World Bank, the number of people affected by acute food insecurity rose from 135 million in 53 countries in 2019 to 345 million in 82 countries in 2022. Of course, high levels of food insecurity and malnutrition can increase the risk of tensions and conflict. And at the same time, conflict and fragility also increase food insecurity and compromise people's ability to cope with and adapt to the ongoing climate crisis. And this is particularly apparent in developing countries where food insecurity where food security is severely compromised by the changing climate conditions, such as drought and flooding, that severely affect land and water systems and overall change the dynamic, quality and quantity of key natural resources. So the nexus between climate change, food systems and conflict is extremely complex, and the way in which climate can affect food insecurity and ultimately exacerbate conflict are multiple and often difficult to disentangle. Let me say that climate change negatively affects all 4 pillars of food security. Food availability may be reduced because the increase in temperature and changes in rainfall patterns reduce crop yield, particularly in the areas that are highly dependent on rain-fed agriculture, and may also induce pests and diseases. And also reduction in food production and productivity may increase prices, or may increase the dependence of countries on food imports, right? So which expose the countries to international price fluctuations or shocks. Food access and instability may be affected by prices, but also by disruptions of market, infrastructure, transport, manufacturing, and retail, and also direct and indirect changes in the incomes, especially of the poor, the low-income consumers. And also rising temperature, increased frequency of extreme events, and increased water scarcity can affect also food utilization through their adverse effect on health and diet intake. So the dynamics involving climate change and food security become even more harmful in countries characterized by weak governance and political instability. In fact, in this context, extremely high levels of food and security and nutrition insecurity, combined with the failing food systems and increasing competition for natural resources, could act as triggers or exacerbating factors for social tension and conflict, and could make a local population more prone to recruitment into armed groups. Climate change may also lands in some areas no more suitable for the cultivation of specific crops, incentivizing phenomena such as, for instance, the clearing of forests for agricultural purpose, or may force households or some households members to migrate, looking for better economic conditions or income diversification. And when not even migration is an available option, people may remain trapped into poverty and become even more food insecure, increasing so the risk of tensions, riots, recruitment in armed groups. And finally, climate change could also trigger the farmer-herder conflict, which is actually something that is on the rise, particularly in West and Central Africa, as increased droughts can force nomadic herders to change their path and compete for water and land. conflict tied to competing claims over rights and renewable resources make adapting to the impact of climate change, of course, even more difficult in already fragile states. So to prevent and reduce increasing climate-related security risk, excuse me, it is therefore crucial to understand the condition under which climate could trigger or exacerbate conflict and identify the channels that can contribute to shape this relationship. And here, let me just very briefly discuss the evidence that we find related to the climate security nexus in Nigeria. Nigeria is currently facing multiple challenges, environmental, economic, political challenges. And here we find that temperature anomalies significantly increase the risk of violent conflict in the country. And children nutritional outcome are one of the main channels through which this occurs. So we believe that this type of studies can be particularly important also from a policy perspective, because they help to understand how and where to intervene to break this circle, no? With the humanitarian development support, social protection measure, and also long-term climate resilience livelihood strategies. Let me stop here. And thanks.
Thanks so much, Marina. That's a lot of things to think about and to discuss later on. Interesting that you mention policymakers. So one of the questions going forward will be, what would be your recommendation to policymakers, indeed? But before we go into that question, we first have Elisa. Elisa, so happy to see you here. I'm so glad to see that you were able to circumvent the IT systems. It's really great to have you here. Before your, while you were finding your way to us, I already briefly introduced you to the participants. I mentioned that you are a lawyer practitioner currently working as a director of land and resources rights at the World Resources Institute. And that your work focuses on strengthening land, environmental, natural resource rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. We know that before joining WRI, you were very active for a long time in advancing women's land and resource rights in many countries. And so we're very happy to have you here, and we really look forward to your insights and your contribution to the panel. So upcoming 7 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and to the other panelists for very interesting interventions there. And it's nice to go after the speaker just before me, because we're kind of thinking about all of these pressures on land. And when there's all of these competing pressures on land and resources, we know already that women, youth, or others who might be marginalized for some reason will feel those pressures, if not more, at least differently than the dominant groups. And so now we can dive a little bit into kind of what some of the legal and policy responses might be to addressing that, and to help ensure that everybody is able to participate within, economically, and participate and perform their roles and responsibilities in their families and communities with the full backing of the legal system behind them, and with the full ability to have options. So in very basic terms, we know that to be effective at enhancing women's engagement and agency in land governance, there's a few things we need. We need the law-making processes, and that includes rule-making processes at the local level, to be inclusive of the diversity of experiences of women and other groups that are marginalized, and first of all, not assuming that those experiences are homogeneous, and also ensuring that the groups who are going to be impacted by legal reforms have some say in what those reforms will be. On the next level, we know, there's a lot to suggest that we need to continue to work on addressing discriminatory laws. They're out there. And they can be discriminatory on their face, or discriminatory in how they're applied or how they're interpreted. And when I use the word interpreted there, I also mean how they're interpreted in administrative systems, how they're integrated into other systems. On another level, when we're talking about law, of course, we need to be sure that the laws are enforced when they're under threat. To the extent that there are rights that are there, they need to be protected when under threat. We need a justice system that's functioning to be able to do that. And we need the justice system to be accessible to women as well as to others. And then finally, the rights need to be, the rights should be exercisable. By that, I mean that that women should be able to use the rights in a way that supports their self-directed decision-making so that they can play the role that they need to play to adapt to climate changes, to respond to the context that they're living in, and not be constrained differently than men might be. So relevant for food systems and climate and conflict, I think in particular is looking at collectively held lands and resources. And so I'm just going to drill a little bit deeper into some of the options for legal and policy engagement of women in those resources. And really the question there, the critical question there is whether women can have voice and agency over how collectively held lands and resources are used and how they're managed and governed. And there are law and policy approaches for that. On the first level, there's the question of membership in the group. And that is, are women able to be members of the collective, the group that holds the collective rights? And very often they're not. And that could be because they're not a member of the lineage. That could be because the rules might exclude them in some way. If they've married into that area, they may be excluded. They might be considered an outsider and may be excluded from being a member of the group that makes the decisions on how those collectively used resources are managed and used and how decisions are made on them. The next level is looking at whether women can have the right to be involved in the governance body. So beyond just being a member in the group, do they have the right to make decisions and to be involved in the decision-making processes on how those lands and resources are governed? Again, that's a critical area where women are excluded, largely because they're considered outsiders or because they may be busy with other responsibilities. So again, looking at the way that governance happens is really critical there in terms of realizing those rights, even if they exist. The next level is looking at leadership and whether women can have a role in leadership in those governing bodies. It's one thing to be voting, it's another to be on the executive committee, for example, and to have some say over how those things are run. And then finally, this one, it's one that's kind of harder to describe, but I'm just going to use a very quick example before I finish up here to explain this one. And it's about agenda setting and whether women's agendas are those that are considered in land and resource governance bodies. And I'm just going to use an example from Cameroon here, community-based forestry management area, where women were in leadership positions. So they were members, they had the right to govern, and they were in leadership positions, commonly in the executive team for the executive group for the management of those resources. And yet when benefits were accrued to the members of the collective of the community forestry group, when it came to deciding how those benefits would be used, it was men's interests that were supported. And it wasn't that women weren't heard. It wasn't women couldn't speak up. They knew that if they did speak, they'd be listened to, but they self-censored because they believed that the agenda was actually one that was driven by men's interests and not by their own. So they were interested, say, for example, in having solar panels that would help support them in their cooking responsibilities, and so students could study in the evenings, and they didn't think that women's interests were worthy of including in the agenda. So it's, for me, that kind of points out that we need to look at law and policy, absolutely, we need to look at those at the most local level, but we also need to look at the social dynamics in households and in communities that are about, whose agenda can drive how we work with these resources, so that it's not just about women playing a role and taking on the additional responsibility of being involved in governance without necessarily benefiting from that themselves. So I'll just, I know I dove deep into the weeds there, but I just thought that would be a nice example to see the different experiences that women and men can have when there are these pressures, external and internal pressures on the same land and resources. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elisa. It's really fascinating what you bring to bear, and a lot of things to think about. while we're slowly but surely getting into the second round of questions, I'm actually inclined to start with you with the first question and go go from there, because your last point on agenda setting sort of triggered me with a thought. Like, okay, so you talk about the social dynamics, and I totally see your point. But then the question is, whose responsibility is it, to change this response to these dynamics? So how do you see that? And so what would be the the action taken by whom to change this?
That's a really good question. And, I actually think if we think about it in terms of responsibility, I think the responsibility is on everybody at all levels of government and administration and governance. But in particular, I think what you're kind of alluding to is something that I see as a bit of a barrier within the land and resource governance sector. And that is, there's this view that there is the technical universe, the technical work that needs to be done, which is the boundaries, demarcating boundaries and creating systems and administration, those things. And then there's this kind of social universe that exists over here, and that if you work on one, you don't work on the other. And traditionally, the land sector focuses much more on those technical elements without considering the social elements. And at least from my perspective, when thinking about governments, national and subnational governments as a starting point, I really think that a lot needs to be done to break down those barriers and understand that this is part of a holistic system. We don't live as humans in just a technical area or just on one resource. We live in landscapes. We think of that. And I think we should think about the landscapes across sectors as well within government. And so to me, that's where the opportunities lie in terms of bridging that gap between the technical and the social. And I think the legal as well, to be honest, because I think that they are often partitioned within the land and resources sector, and that ends up doing a disservice to the women and men that we know are using and relying those resources in a much more holistic way.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the following questions will be more on the people-centered approach. So I'm looking forward to your thoughts on that. But before we get there, Marina, so also for you the question. So what action should be taken by whom? So what approach should you prioritize in bringing these solutions further? And what would be the actor that you would identify here?
Sure. So I tend to completely agree with the intervention of the previous speakers. So I would say that, first of all, governments need to recognize the relationship between climate, peace, and security, really as a pivotal political issue, and take a concrete action to bring this consideration into legislation and policy accordingly. And in particular, as Elisa was saying, I think that achieving climate security needs a comprehensive approach that acknowledges the interconnectedness of climate change, conflict, food security, and natural resources preservation, and devise policy frameworks that are capable of pursuing really holistic and integrated objectives across multiple pillars and dimensions simultaneously. And here, let me do an example of a study that we did in Uganda that was just published, where we investigated the interlinkages between commercial agriculture, internal migration for agricultural purposes, and deforestation. So the problem is that the agricultural expansion that is often incentivized by local governments to increase food security, food production, and to support rural development is sometimes unintentionally occurring at the expenses of the forest. So in this setting, land access and tenure arrangement play a big role. Because, for example, in Uganda, land and tenure arrangement are quite fluid and responsive, let's say, to shifts in economic conditions. So what happened is basically that because of few statutory or customary prohibition on land use and forest clearing, landholders and farmers, also coming from other regions attracted by productive land tend to prioritize land clearing for production over forest conservation. And this could potentially cause also tension between migrants and hosting communities, because sometimes migrants may not be totally aware of the unwritten rules governing those lands, or may use unsustainable or unsuitable practices for this land. So why I'm saying this? Because in contexts like Uganda, that are characterized by multiple crises and multiple needs, there's really the need of coordination among different policies. So policies in favor of rural development agriculture, but also preserving forests and natural resources, promoting integrating land use planning, and also integrating migrants. And here, let me add briefly two more things. So one, from this perspective, it is very critical that key government actors get access to appropriate knowledge and tools to ensure that the climate action is pursued in a way that is sensitive to the specific risk characterizing the specific context. So in this sense, the role of science and research is very important. And second, I think it's very important the role of it's very important the relationship between the state and the society, because sometimes there is still a lack of dialogue and engagement between the central states and the local actors, including, for example, traditional leaders or women's group, business association. So it is very important to invest in awareness, preparedness to live with the changing environment, and it is important to help relevant stakeholders to understand the impact of climate change from an on-site perspective. Stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Marina. So the same question for you, Ermina, on who should take action.
Yes.
Look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you, Arthur. Well, it's not easy to be the last one to answer that question, because a lot of my thoughts were already expressed by previous speakers. But just to end that, just to add that I think from our perspective, also referring to the study that we have just published at the IDLO, even though the land, water, and other natural resources like forest and fisheries are like foundation for communities and people across geographies for food security, yet our research showed that the inability to access land is one of the main problems that is actually faced by people now globally, due to many existing challenges and patterns of, for example, land grabbing or concentrating farming in the hands of large commercial producers. So from having that in mind, I think one of the most important recommendations stemming from our research is that governments should establish secure land tenure systems, specifically targeting and addressing excluded and marginalized people and communities and their needs, and also that land tenure systems should protect diverse forms of tenure, including customary rights to land and other natural resources. So, for example, in that regard, states should adopt or revise land laws and policies to align them with international standards. And here I would like to refer to the voluntary guidance on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests in the context of national food security that was adopted last year by FAO. Then what Elisa already mentioned, we absolutely agree at IDLO that we need to push for feminist approach to guarantee that women's rights to land and natural resources are protected, because that it has to have a priority, because that can achieve holistic response to food insecurity, not only for women and girls, but for all. Also, as Marina previously mentioned, pastoralists and herders. In case of pastoralists, we our research shows that the law should reflect their right to temporary but timely use of natural space, which should be secured through land tenure and somehow reflected in the law to avoid precisely the rise of conflicts. For smallholder farmers, the government should act to strengthen to make sure that their tenure is secure and is well embedded and protected in the law, and also recognize diverse forms of tenure. In case of indigenous people, laws should acknowledge indigenous rights to land and natural resources and support the self-determination in regard to food systems. If I may just add, I know I might be slowly running out of time, but if I may just add that not only we need to establish fair and inclusive laws, strong institutions, but we also governments should also look and engage more with customary and informal actors. As Marina mentioned, that they are so important at the communities level, because they are those who often have central law in governance over land within communities. And going further, a governance should also enforce customary and informal justice systems and build connections here to address for dispute resolution over land and natural resources. So certain conflicts are actually resolved at the community level. That respects human rights and reflects the gender. Also, I think what was already also mentioned, but just to say again that I think there is a need for a comprehensive approach to invest in durable rule of law solutions to address the root causes, which are very often complex and relate to intersection of humanitarian development and peace building challenges. So working here at this Nexus is essential for also ensuring the holistic and durable solutions for food security, conflict prevention, and driving transformative climate action. Thank you.
Thanks, Emina. Actually, what you mentioned about the holistic approach, and others have been alluding to as well, sort of nicely segues into the next question. And you will notice that we're trying to get into an action mode. So once we have established that where we are, what the challenges are, what the barriers are, of course, the next question is, with COP28 and other negotiations next year upcoming, what are we going to recommend to policymakers and others? Now, before we get to the policymakers, first, the intermediate question is, what is an action that you would prioritize? So based on your extensive work, all three of you, what is something that you have seen in practice that works? Because if we know that, we can build on that towards recommendations for policymakers. And I'm going to ask all three of you who I can give the floor first, but I see Elisa already unmuting. So please go ahead.
Sure. I like talking about action. That's where I get the most excitement. But I can say, one of the things that I think is really needed and is, well, let me frame it this way. There is actually, when it comes to land tenure, specifically land and resource tenure, there is a lot that's happening on the ground. And it's a lot that's there's a lot that's happening that's driven by people in customary tenure systems, that's driven by civil society, but it's happening on a very small scale. And so I think one of the needs in terms of actions that could, I think, help move things forward is to be able to understand from among all the things that are happening at that hyper-local level, what about those things are working, what's not working, how do we understand what the evidence that would support that an approach that is working for people on the ground, that then we can, with that evidence base, use that evidence to connect into the larger subnational and national policy processes, so that those things, that those hyper localized actions that have local legitimacy and that are working, are integrated into these bigger policy frameworks. And I think that connection between the hyperlocal and the kind of subnational and national scaling, that's where there's a really big opportunity right now. And, you know, the land sector has a history of being a bit more top down, right, in terms of its reforms. And so I actually think that reversal needs to happen, and it is happening in some places, but I think it needs to continue to happen. And that would require an investment both at that local level, the hyperlocal level, continually investing in those actions on the ground, better understanding of what's working and why, and to understand, you know, what elements of that are scalable, are replicable, and then feeding those into those subnational and national and regional policy processes, and even eventually, I think, influencing global discourse around what works and what's actually working for that at that hyperlocal level, and so that it's those local realities that are driving what's happening in all of those other levels. And for me, that's how I think that is happening a little bit now, but that's where I see the big gap and the opportunity at the moment in this space. Thanks.
Thanks, Elisa. Marina, Ermina, Marina, please go ahead.
Yeah, so let me answer by saying what my team do, what we think is important, which is also pretty much in line with what Elisa was saying. So basically, CGIAR has invested significantly in the past few years in developing a climate security research agenda aimed at qualifying and quantifying the impact of climate on drivers of conflict and tensions. And in particular, the CGIAR focused climate security team has 4 main objectives. One, provide rigorous scientific evidence on the Nexus that can provide entry points for climate resilience of vulnerable communities, peace building, and mitigation of the climate security risk. Second, to support policy processes that address inequalities that are exacerbated by climate, such as those related to food, land, and water insecurity. And so help policymakers with effective targeting to the most vulnerable population, programming, and participating in, informing, supporting decision investments over climate, agriculture, and food security. 3, engage with local partners to contribute to capacity building. And 4, the ultimate goal is really becoming a bridging entity linking science with stakeholders across the climate development and peace. And in particular, across our research and initiative, there is a common focus on understanding the gender dynamics, differential vulnerabilities and risk, because as Elisa was saying, these sort of risks are not homogeneous across the population. So there's really the need to understand who are the most vulnerable and what can we do for that. And so what are the risks associated with the impact of climate-induced failing in food, land, and water systems that leads to tension, conflict, and displacement? What are the intersecting systems of discrimination, disadvantages, and how do they shape really inequalities, gender inequalities? And this is really because we want to ensure that our outputs contribute to highlighting the knowledge, experience, and resilient capacity and mechanism of women, but not only women, also youth and ethnic minorities in this climate conflict nexus. Among our main initiatives, I would like to mention the climate resilience, the livestock and the agri-lac resilient initiative, and the fragility, conflict, and migration, where we specifically focus on refugees and displaced population. That is another category already mentioned that is particularly vulnerable. Think that only in 2022, over 100 million people were forcibly displaced in the world, and 80% of these people are experiencing food insecurity and malnutrition. So we try to understand what are the climatic-related determinants of displacement, how we can anticipate compound crisis to avoid or better manage massive displacement, and also in the hosting areas, what are the categories of the people that are affected by displacement, and what can we do to increase their resilience. And finally, let me also mention another initiative, another thing. We have recently launched the CGIAR Climate Security Observatory, that is a global decision support platform that provides the latest scientific evidence on how climate is exacerbating root causes of conflict, where this is happening at subnational level, for whom, and what can we do. So this is just to say that we really believe that science and research is extremely important to provide evidence and to inform. Thanks.
Thanks, Marina. I can imagine this observatory that you mentioned can also be a huge inspiration to many to find approaches and ways forward.
I hope so. And yeah, I can share the link actually. Yeah.
I think many would benefit from it. Yes, thank you. Emina, any thoughts you would like to add from your end?
Yes, thank you, Arthur. So IDLO has worked in a number of places around the globe, trying to address those issues that we've been discussing today. And I think I would like to go back to this land and resource tenure because at IDLO we believe that this is basically the core for people and communities to live in dignity and realize their human rights, like for example, right to food. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the way IDLO is working, we both aim to legally empower vulnerable communities, but also we work with governments and institutions to make sure that the outcome, their outcome, to make sure that we have people-centered laws and policies, but also people-centered institutions that are actually putting the vulnerable communities front and center of their activities. And I would like to refer to a few examples of how we've been working and what have been done and achieved. So, for example, in Rwanda, IDLO is working in urban and rural districts, which are severely affected by climate change. And for example, in Bugesera district, we have seen number of land evictions that are happening as a response to the pressure that is coming actually from the central government for districts to promote investment and transformation of land use that would aim for the overall economic development of the country. However, these evictions, these relocations have resulted in lack of legal compensation and financial compensation for detachment of their property and land, violation of numerous human rights, which then fueled competition over land and resources, also inequalities and vulnerabilities, ultimately conflict and tensions. So what IDLO has been doing in those regions is that we have been engaging in developing the capacity of the Abunzi committees, which are the local mediators, to develop decentralized dispute resolution system over land and natural resources. And right now, they are responsible for over 80% of land-related disputes, which demonstrate, and that actually demonstrates how important these informal systems are for the communities. At the same time, in parallel, IDLO is working to strengthen the capacity of the National Land Authority, which was assigned a quasi-judicial role in land dispute resolution to ensure people-centered approach. Then in Asia, for example, we are addressing a number of states like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam to provide them with some kind of introductory course on environmental and climate law for judges from this region. And the goal of this is to promote people-centered solutions developed by judiciary based on people's needs, reflecting their needs, including the right to food and nutrition. In Jordan, we are currently supporting also the government in the operationalization of the newly created Food Security Council to enhance food security for vulnerable people, with a particular emphasis on rural and refugee women. So this way, we are trying to strengthen a feminist approach that centers women and girls as rights holders, food consumers, and food producers. So I think these are the examples that show how we can what kind of tools we can use and what kind of pathways we can use to actually secure people-centered approach and strengthen the rights of those who are most vulnerable to food insecurity, climate shocks, and conflicts. Thank you.
Thanks, Amina, for mentioning these very inspiring experiences. So the next question, coming closer and closer to action and to recommendations. So what would be your specific recommendation for policymakers? Already mentioned COP28 coming up, but we know that there are other, and to some extent parallel negotiations happening as well, end of this year, next year. So what is it that you would recommend to policymakers to be aware of and to contribute to in their in what they decide? And now, before I ask you, I also to mention that we have a few questions already in the chat, and so for you to already think about the link between what we're discussing here in this nexus between climate, food security, and conflict, and the link to the rights of nature. It's a very challenging one, I think, but it's a very interesting one. So I thought I mentioned it already now, so you can sort of collect some thoughts for later. But first of all, your input or your recommendation for policymakers. And I'm just looking at the one who's unmuting first. Marina, you're first. Oh. Please go ahead.
I won. Yeah, so I would say that fair and inclusive food system transformation can occur only with the support of climate finance. And climate finance needs to, in particular, reach the most vulnerable countries and population that are those affected by compounded climate crisis risk. And I'm saying this because the distribution of these funds so far has been quite unbalanced, with a significant proportion directed toward the countries that are relatively more stable and secure. And this is because, first, fragile and conflict-affected states struggle to access climate finance due to a range of factors, including institutional limitations and ongoing conflict. And second, because many of these countries lack the absorptive capacity to effectively utilize large-scale financing, often due to weak governance structures, a lack of technical know-how, or inadequate infrastructure. And these two core issues often intersect, making even harder and more challenging for this vulnerable nation to leverage climate finance for meaningful impact. But at the same time, this also, I think that also signifies untapped potential for impactful investments. So, for example, readiness activities aimed at building institutional capacity can go a long way in helping these countries to face the complexity of climate finance, strengthening governance structure, enhancing technical expertise, can enable these countries to implement larger scale projects effectively, thus elevating their ability to absorb and effectively utilize this funding. And more generally, I would say that there's a need to specifically tailor financing mechanism to this context and ensure that climate finance support that the climate finance supports the adaptive capacity of marginalized group as a means to prevent or to reduce the risk of conflict, unrest, and also involuntary migration. And at the same time, also donors, international finance institutions, and climate funds have to increase their awareness of the climate security nexus, as we were mentioning earlier, and so target the conflict affected areas for the delivery of climate funds. And I think that from this perspective, the COP28 can be potentially a turning point to move in this direction, hopefully.
Thank you, Ermina. I'm so glad that we're recording this webinar, because I think what you laid out is actually a policy agenda. Thanks for your very comprehensive and input. Ermina, Elisa, who could I ask you to add some thoughts to what would be your recommendation for policymakers? Ermina, you're unmuted.
Yes, thank you. I think from my side, I would like to add and recommend that we should focus on empowering people and communities, in particular women and girls, and addressing growing inequalities. And in that context, we can use those international forums to champion the approach and promote rule of law as an enabler of people-centered approaches to food system transformation, conflict prevention, and to transformative climate action. And we were mentioning COP28, and I think it is, for me, I believe this is particularly important ahead of the COP28, as there is a new agenda item that is focusing on just transition. And it is crucial to ensure that this agenda actually reflects human rights, equity, and equality, and deliver a gender-responsive just transition for all. I would also like to add that this kind of approach is aligned well with the outcomes of the 51st session of the Committee on World Food Security that took place last week at FAO here in Rome. So the CFS, the Committee for Food Security, endorsed voluntary guidelines on gender equality and women's rights empowerment in the context of food security and nutrition. That was that urged states to implement, strengthen, and introduce legislation that is promoting non-discrimination and gender equality. And overall provides a very detailed support to member state development partners and other stakeholders to advance the gender equality, women's rights and girls' rights, to empower them and build their agency, also as part of the efforts to eradicate hunger and malnutrition. Then, additionally, CFS, the Committee on Food Security, endorsed the report on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition, prepared by the CFS high-level panel of experts. And yes, and here inequalities in food security and nutrition was indicated as one of the main factors leading to hunger that actually exists all over the regions, everywhere in the world, and is a result of compounding disadvantages such as gender, education, economic and social status, geographic location, or ethnicity. And as such, it was recommended by the report to approach this problem through an intersectional lens and multi-sectoral governance over food security and nutrition, which also shows how how far behind we are still, and how important it is to address those intrinsic inequalities in order to advance the 2030 agenda. And yes, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Hermina, and also for bringing in the recent developments in the CFS. Elisa, your recommendation, please.
And I thankfully went third because I think that Hermina and Marina both captured the universe of what I think my recommendations would be. So I can be short by saying I think there's something, one of the values, I think, or one of the things that happens in these global discussions or global discourse, global policy setting agenda is there's a lot of rallying that's done around simple data points and simple messages to get behind. And that's good and valuable because I think that that's something that, you can build momentum around it. But as we've learnt in decades and decades of development practice, and as is reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals and the indicators and targets associated with that, the reality is much more complex. So if I was to make a recommendation for COP28 and policymakers there, it would be to learn from what we've been learning from in the development sector for the past 40, 50 years, and to really be guided by the work that's already been done in the 2030 agenda and have that be integrated fully into the climate agenda. Because a lot of these things have really been well thought out, and there's a lot of effort that's already been made into kind of thinking through these and bringing in that nuance and, some nice jazzy indicators in there as well that we can rally behind. So I really think that there's, again, this is kind of breaking down that barrier, that idea of kind of breaking down this barrier between these discussions that happen at this level and what's been happening for decades in the development sector. And I think drawing from what my colleagues on the panel have said, there's a lot there that's already happening that we can integrate into those climate policy discourses, and we can not try to reinvent the wheel, but really build on what's already happening and where there already are commitments and very good guidance for policymakers. Thanks.
Thanks so much. No, that's really very it's a bit sobering maybe, but it's at the same time it's a very valid point to make and to be aware of. Absolutely. We also have some questions in the chat, so I'd like to really acknowledge those that took this opportunity to ask you questions. I think all of them are very valuable and very thought-provoking. And actually, I would like to start with the first one. It's always good to acknowledge the first one asking the question, breaking the ice. And it's not the easiest one. It's about the link to, as I already mentioned, to rights of nature and or ecocide, another big development, as a rule of law approach, and does it play a role in this nexus of climate, food insecurities, and conflict? I would ask you to be brief on these because I think we can easily organize another webinar on only this question. It's a very thought-provoking one, but we have a few other questions that I think would also be very valuable to address. So I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if anyone feels like addressing this question of the link to the rights of nature, then yes, please, Elisa, go ahead.
I think, thanks. I'll take a stab at it, but I'm happy for others to jump in here. One of the things I think that's quite interesting when we're looking at nature and the discourse that's happening now, and the importance of elevating nature in this discussion that we're having around about where we are in this moment of crisis. In many ways, if we, I don't want to romanticize certain communities or kind of place a utilitarian value on that, but we we know that there is, for communities who are closely connected to the land that they live on and may regard that as territory. So thinking then about Indigenous communities or communities who have these long-standing traditions of proximity to nature, there's good evidence that's coming out now that shows that they are the best stewards of the of nature and of the land and the resources. And it's in part because I think, you know, their understanding of nature isn't kind of based around sectors and isn't based around, you know, a narrow view of it serves this purpose or doesn't have this utilitarian view. And I think perhaps there's something that we can learn there. And it's, again, going through this kind of much more holistic and landscape or territory view of the way that land and resources work. And I think if we built that thinking into our thinking and in various policy arenas, that we would go very far to being able to both protect and promote nature. I don't know if that would equate with the rights of nature, but at least protect and promote nature at the same time as you know, supporting livelihoods and supporting self-determination and other things like that. So I think that there's a connection there, but it has to do with linking much more holistically and taking ourselves out of this kind of sectoral view of the way that the world works. So I hope that's not too incomplete an answer, but I'm happy for the other panelists to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa, for opening this discussion and making it relevant to the you know, the topic at hand. Marina, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I will just add to what Elisa was saying, simply saying that basically if we don't learn to respect the environment, there will not be food security, there will not be sustainability, there will not be peace. And this is something that we have to clearly understand. I would say that this concept needs to be put in practice at all levels. So not only at a very local level, but also at a very high levels. And understand that, for example, if we clear forests for economic purposes, we will not go that far. And yeah, simply that. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Emina, any thoughts from your end?
Yeah, just adding to what Elisa and Marina said, and especially the fact that we need to learn to respect environment. I just wanted to bring us back a little bit to this role of law and regulations, because they should actually reflect that. So, for example, the laws and regulations can be adopted to promote like those holistic ecological farming systems and nature-based approaches that then contribute to, for example, preservation of indigenous knowledge, promotion of diversity in genetic resources through the recognition of the right of peasants and other people working in rural areas, and also using and exchanging and selling their own seeds, just as an example. But I wanted to say that I think we're remembering how important the laws and regulations and powerful they can be, and working around that to reflect the need for the nature-based solutions. It's crucial for not only food security, but also climate and peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Emina. I'm inclined to go to a next question because, as I said, this is something that we easily can spend another half an hour or an hour on. But I hope for the one asking the question that at least that we were able to provide some reflections for further thinking. So Marina, there is a question that is actually more addressed to you. It's about the practices you would recommend for safeguarding rights of climate migrants and refugees. And while you are answering that question, or sort of pondering or having your reflections, There is also an interesting question asking to the potential of public-private partnerships in strengthening these approaches, and what have you seen works, is successful in practice? So that's also an interesting one, just to put it out there. Well, Marina, could I ask you to maybe address the question on the safeguarding rights of climate migrants?
Yes. So the question is how I think that migration could be made safe, basically. Yeah. So first of all, I really think that migrants have the rights to migrate, but not in conditions where they are extremely fragile, where they have no options but migration, in condition where they are extremely poor. So first of all, I think that choosing to migrate, having the right resources, and having the also the liberty of choosing where to go and where to basically finding their better opportunities for life. I think that is first of all an important step for improving the safety of migration. Of course, there is a lot to be done also at the institution and governmental levels. So I would say that it's important to offer potential livelihoods, decent livelihoods in the origin areas, but at the same time it is important to accompany and to have policies that try to integrate and try to establish good livelihoods also in the settlements or in the hosting communities, trying to understand what could be the obstacles for the migrants to realize that. And I mean, of course, there could be a lot to say.
Yeah.
I'll stop here.
Yes, thanks. It also ties in to these holistic approaches, that are so important, and away from the silos. And definitely, thank you. Yeah. Then on the which is also an interesting entry point, the public-private partnerships in addressing the nexus between food security, climate, and conflict. Any thoughts or good practices, and if you have seen and would like to share? That's interesting. Yes, Elisa.
Well, perhaps, one of the things, and I think this is a tricky one to talk about, because when looking at the actions of corporate actors, as who are stakeholders and who are part of the ecosystem of all of these pressures that are on land and resources that we kind of find ourselves in, it's tricky to answer, because like sometimes we think of in certain situations, in certain contexts, corporate actors can be perpetrating disrespect for rights and violence against people who are trying to defend their rights, and even sometimes when they're following the letter of the law, because we do know that not all the laws are really good. So I just wanted to highlight that it is a very tricky question, but there are some examples, I think, that are coming out particularly from the business and human rights related community, where there have been Indigenous groups and local communities who have taken some agency in engaging with corporate actors who have an interest in their land and resources. I don't know I mean, of course, and this is looking specifically in the context of extraction. And I know that extraction is also linked to issues with climate, just transition from replacing fossil fuels, but also potentially for conflict. So they're all kind of related. But I think from within that community, there is an emerging kind of collection of stories of positive things that are happening, particularly in places where concepts like the free, prior, informed consent are being applied appropriately, and where that consent has actually kind of moved towards an actual negotiation that allows for agency of the local communities. So I can't think of, I will see if I can find and share in the chat. There are some examples. There's a new platform that's being developed that's highlighting some of these kind of positive cases where local communities or Indigenous peoples have been able to engage positively with the corporate actor to not just promote and protect their own rights, but to actively engage in the design of the investment or extraction or whatever is happening, so that it's mutually beneficial. And so that, there's meat to this idea of them having consent. I don't know how well that connects to the idea, these other concepts of climate pressures and conflict, but I think looking at those solutions is quite interesting. So I'll send them in the chat now, but that's a really good question. And I think they're an important contributor to this whole discussion that we're having here that's often overlooked. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Elisa. And what comes to my mind is the coming together of interest in access and benefit sharing from natural resources, where there is the Indigenous peoples, the custodians of natural resources and genetic resources, and at the other hand, the private interests that are there from corporates, and so that's also an interesting point to and an entry point for the person that asked the question to maybe look into. I see we have a few minutes on the clock. There is a very interesting question that I would like to end with, and that is whether there are examples of food insecure people and communities being able to use the law and pathways to justice to realize their rights. It goes actually to the core of our discussion here. So, but I also want to, before we get to that final question, I wanted to, of course, ask Marina and Irmina whether they have any thoughts on the public-private partnerships, and hopefully brief, because we're slowly but surely getting to the end of our of the time that we have allotted for this webinar. Irmina, I see you unmuting.
Yes, thank you. Just very, very briefly, I'm not sure I can answer precisely that question, but what I wanted to flag is that there is some room here for promoting responsible investment in agriculture and value chains, in actually creating laws that secure investment for small, and that provide support for small scale producers and all the excluded and marginalized groups, and includes the people-centered approach, meaning that those regulations are they reflect transparency, they have a meaningful and participation of all rights holders. There is like a social impact assessment of investment building and all the grievance mechanisms in investment schemes. So I just wanted to flag very briefly that I think that might be important when we think about public-private partnerships.
Thanks for mentioning that. Marina, on public-private partner? No, you're good. Okay, thank you.
I think that my colleagues have answered more than what I could.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of things to further dive into, for sure. Then on the last question, could I ask you to again briefly mention, and I'll go to the question, are there examples of food insecure people and communities being able to use the law and pathways to justice to realize their rights? Yeah, that's one to think about. Have you seen these practices, and what comes to mind in terms of mentioning those? Irmina, I see you unmuting.
Yes, because I think the Rwanda example that I mentioned before could be actually an excellent example of that, because yes, this is the example when people gather together, they use the law, they use the informal customary pathways to justice to actually realize their rights. So I will not repeat exactly the project, but I think it's an excellent example of how empowering people can make them realize their rights and fight for their land and secure their livelihood. So yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely. It's a very good example. Elisa, Marina, by way of last intervention for this webinar.
Well, just highlight, I mean, I think this is an interesting example where there's efforts underway now. So I think that the jury's still out on the success of this, but there's efforts underway now to improve production of food within in Lesotho. And that is directly linked to reforming the legal framework that allows women to have rights to inherit land, and for married women to have rights to land and property. So that in that particular example, the relationship between food production at the local level and for local economies is directly linked to necessary changes in the law that's quite discriminatory as it stands now. So I think that that's just an example of where that connection's being made. And I'm sure that there are many other examples like that. Thanks.
Thanks for that contribution. Marina.
Yeah, I could mention two examples in which customary justice systems could make a difference, but unfortunately, I mean, so far not successful examples, in the sense that unfortunately we didn't reach yet this. So basically this is because the interconnectedness of climate, security and migration is particularly evident in fragile contexts, no? So we have two relevant examples. So one,
could I ask you to mention one, because we are running out of time.
Lake Chad. So in this example, the reduction of the lake surface, drought and sandstorms, and the impact on agricultural influence of agricultural activities have influenced the vulnerability of this community, exposing them to the exploitation of the Boko Haram. So in this example, I mean, the application of an efficient justice systems could really make a difference. And yeah, I just mentioned this one.
Thanks for mentioning this one. I think it only shows how much work there is still out there, and what we have covered in this 90 minutes is a lot of ground, ranging from agenda setting and the social dynamics to what works in practice and the barriers in practice. What we our last round of examples. I will refrain from any sort of heroic attempts to summarize, but I would like to emphasize some of the things that kept coming back. The local legitimacy was mentioned, data-driven, scientific-driven approaches is so important. Feminist approaches, the role of women and girls. I mean, it was like a silver lining throughout our discussion. I think it's clear that there lies a pathway to justice. People-centered approaches to changing institutions is very important. And of course, and that would then be my last remark, focusing on livelihoods of people. And I think that's where this nexus comes together. But for sure, this is not the end of this discussion. But I'm sure that with our discussion, we've been able to provide further thinking, further suggestions, further recommendations for others to build on and for us to take forward. So I would like to thank you, Irmina and Marina and Elisa, for being here, for sharing your thoughts so openly and transparently. It's really appreciated. Also, thanks to those that joined us for this webinar and the questions that were asked. And of course, also to the organizers of the Berlin Climate Security Conference, the German Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Adelphi. And so with that, I would like to wish you all a very good day and hope to see you and continue the conversation somewhere else, whether it's online or in person. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Bye-bye.